Morning, afternoon, good evening, and tonight we are invoking theism.
How are you doing, my good sir?
How's it going, guys? Pretty good.
Yeah, pretty good. It'll be nice to talk to you.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. Thanks for having me on.
Tell the dear audience all about yourself.
All right. Well, yeah, like you said, I am invoking theism. That is my channel. Also, my social media too, Twitter and Instagram. I'm pretty active on Twitter. That's where you'll find me posting kind of my thoughts throughout the week. But yeah, my whole goal is really to just in my videos, I kind of just it's public expression of where I'm at in terms of the field of philosophy of religion, making videos on topics on metaphysics, God's existence, arguments, things of that sort. So my main specialties are the philosophy of mind, um, uh, probability, Bayes theorem, things of that sort. So consciousness, and then just trying to present and put together some of the more academic and rigorous defenses of theism. So that's kind of where I sit, and that's what I do.
Yeah, I remember prior to this show, I actually gave you a PDF file of, a collection of academic works that I've accumulated over the past couple months for, my research into determinism. Yeah, basically,
Yeah,
did you ever get a chance to check that out a bit?
I didn't. I haven't yet.
Mm. I think it's like 600 pages.
Oh, geez, that's a book.
Yeah, I mean, basically, my story is I wanted to do a book. Not a book. I want to do a video, a comprehensive review of the literature on determinism, and so I read that entire thing from start to finish, took notes, and then I made my video on it. Now, what's your position exactly on free will for the audience to know?
Yeah, so my position currently on free will, a little disclaimer, free will, determinism, compatibilism, free will, things incompatibilism have all been uh, topics that have been interesting to me, but they haven't been areas of research where I've done any in-depth study. I've been mainly doing in-depth study on that have been occupying my time on things of like studying other atheist philosophers and going into trying to understand the contemporary sciences of today and things of that sort. And it's an interesting like philosophy of action is also a really interesting field of study. My current metaphysical leanings and sympathies lie in the libertarian camp. Um, and I would not be a determinist given my current metaphysics, given that I think that necessitarianism is a pretty I don't think it's a good view. And of course, the reason why I bring up necessitarianism is because if I accept a determinism, I also accept a necessary foundation, a necessary ground of all causal things, then I'm going to put myself into a classic sponistic modal collapse scenario. And I don't think necessitarianism is really a view that makes sense of our experience. So I can't really go with determinism, but I do lean towards the libertarian side of things. So far, I haven't really seen any issues. I have gone issues that have made me go, okay, I mean, I should throw this out because there's different views um, in terms of the libertarian camp. I think that Timothy O'Connor has a pretty good book on it. Um, I forget which what the name of the book is, but it's his more comprehensive book on it. I've been going back and forth with some other peers of mine who have some um, kind of some worries in relation to the PSR and contrastive explanations, and that libertarian free choices lack explanations for contrastives, and so then you kind of bring in brute explanations kind of come into the picture there. And so there's some things in there too that can be looked into. Luck objection. I think Timothy O'Connor actually has a pretty good response to the luck objection, because I think he is what's his view? I think he takes an agent causal view of free will, something of that sort. And so that's kind of just a little winded way of kind of putting where I'm at currently. But like I said, I really haven't studied it in my terms of in-depth to my own personal satisfaction. I can't really say that I'm very too confident leaning either which way. So that's how I'm going to put it.
All right, Brass, do you want to ask him or should I?
You can ask him this time.
Does the power of Christ compel you?
Oh, why you gotta say it like that? Does the power of Christ?
Does the power of Christ compel you?
You know, some days it feels like it, some days it doesn't.
Yeah, I'm obligated to ask me and him are obligated contractually to ask every Christian we have on here if the power of Christ compels them.
That's funny.
Because I'm always hoping that one day I'll have a Christian on here that will get that it's an Exorcist reference.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's your
just goes.
Which argument for the existence of God do you find most compelling?
Okay, so awesome. So my entire view on this whole subject, arguments for God, has completely shifted and changed over the past year and a half. And so I think that. So okay, I'm just thinking of where to start. I think that arguments. It's interesting. So my take on arguments has changed with that too. I'm very sympathetic. I would say I'm a quasi-Oppian in terms of Graham Oppie, in terms of his view of arguments. I think that arguments have these crucial limits that we should pay attention to in terms of what they're actually able to do. And I think that arguments are tools for aiding and building global metaphysical theories. I don't think that arguments really do much if you just present a syllogism to someone, or you present a syllogism and try to defend it. I don't think that. I think there are many limits there that we need to pay attention to, and so I'll get into what I mean by that. The first thing is that an argument is a set of sentences and a conclusion, and these sentences or propositions they all have metaphysical underpinnings. So all someone needs to do to not accept your argument is to reject one of your premises. That's very easy. I don't have to. That's all you need to do. And then now the person presenting the argument has to do the heavy lifting of showing, okay, well, let's have a conversation. Why do you disagree with those premises? Now, there's no use in presenting an argument with premises that are laden with certain metaphysical positions that your interlocutor just does not accept. So I'm not a Thomist. And so any Thomistic argument, I'm not going to use because I don't subscribe to Thomistic metaphysics. And so if a Thomist is, let's say, trying to present Aquinas' fourth way or something, or some sort of deante, and they want to convince this atheist, here's a proof I have. Well, if an atheist doesn't share those metaphysics, then the atheist has nothing to do with that argument. And the Thomist has nothing to do with the atheist because they don't share those metaphysical views. So then they have to step back from the argument and they have to now talk about the metaphysics. And to me, we need to be talking about, and what I've seen is, and I think is a successful strategy is stepping back and looking at it theoretically. What is the total worldview being discussed here? So, you know, if you were to present an argument, let's say from logic, right? Someone tries to present an argument from logic for God's existence. Well, if the argument from logic for God's existence is predicated upon a realist view of propositions, and an atheist is an anti-realist in terms of abstracta, then the atheist just gets to deny all the premises because their metaphysics just does not line up with the metaphysics that the argument is utilizing to get to their conclusion. And so
And arguments aren't evidence.
I think there's better ways to say that. Yeah. I did do a video on that, and I took it down because yeah, but I think that as a platitude is not a good response. So that's kind of like how I view arguments. I think that arguments to then be tools to build total worldviews, to build total theories. So theism is a theory of reality. It's a grand metaphysical theory of reality. It says something specific about the way reality is. And same thing with naturalism, and same thing with something like an axiarchism of like John Leslie or something. You have these global theories in which say very specific things about the foundations of reality, about the normative facts of reality, about the cosmos, and things of that sort. And so what I've been noticing lately is, you know what, that might take us onto a tangent. Let me stick on track. So for me, I think that that cumulative case approaches to theism is the right way to go. I think that is the main way in which you should be approaching God's existence, because you can't just present a fine-tuning argument and get to a perfect being alone from a fine-tuning argument, because the fine-tuning argument is one datum. It's one data point. It's about the fact that we live in a life-permitting universe. And when we do our comparative assessments, we go, okay, well, is it even likely on theism in the first place that we would live in a life-permitting universe? It may not be, but even if it's unlikely on theism that we live in a life-permitting universe and that fine-tuning does act as confirmation of theism, it can only do so if it's even more unlikely on naturalism. So theism itself might not even be a good explanation of anything, but it's a better explanation of the alternatives. And my problem is I'll see someone presents a fine-tuning argument and they're like, oh, yes, this is evidence for God, and this does enough. And it doesn't. It's the same way when an atheist presents an argument from evil. An argument from evil, I'm still struggling to see how much an argument from evil raises the likelihood of naturalism. Does it really raise it all that much? Because it's prima facie evidence. Okay, yeah, if we look at let's say some example of pointless evil, we look at naturalism, yeah, okay, it's not surprising. It might not even be likely on naturalism that evils would occur because you need some preconditions. Does naturalism predict consciousness, and does naturalism predict an orderly universe or fine-tuning it all? Well, no, but it's not so surprising on naturalism that you would have evils, and that's all you really need. And on theism, it is somewhat surprising that you would have certain pointless evils and things of that sort. So that's what I see is like, oh, here's an argument from evil, or here's a fine-tuning argument. And it's like, you guys don't realize that this doesn't really get you to raise the probability of these as much as you need it to. So a cumulative case is honestly what you need. You need to take into consideration all the independent bits of evidence. And so, yeah, that's where I'm at. So building metaphysical theories first, arguments are tools for building those, and then cumulative case to build the case for theism. So that's where I'm currently at.
Yeah. I do remember that some theists have made the argument that, gratuitous evil is actually a properly basic belief because, it aligns with how we really, most humans view the world. And, most humans really look at the world and intuitively they say that, yeah, this is pointless evil. Uh, would you be more in the position to agree with that sort of statement, where intuitively, pointless evil is sort of a given?
Yeah, I think that we are quick to intuitively we're quick to say, well, this is apparently pointless, so it is pointless. So it must be pointless. The jump from supposedly pointless to pointless is something that I think is intuitive. Um, I think that it's actually a lot harder to really identify a pointless evil. Um, and because that requires that we step back and we look at our entire epistemic purview. And this is kind of where like the skeptical theists come in, right? Skeptical theism being the thesis that we should exercise some epistemic modesty in terms of whether or not an evil is justified, or let's say that if God exists, then we should be epistemically modest in our assessment of whether or not God has a morally sufficient reason or not for allowing such an evil to occur. I think that we are quick to jump to well, I just don't see any point to what's happening over here or there or whatever. And we have to remember that humans, I mean, we aren't logic machines. We often make our decisions based on our emotions, then justify it with logic later.
Hey, wait. Before you go on, did you come to that conclusion by using logic, or did you use emotions to first come to it, and then now you're just using logic to reason into it?
I would say that no, I see what you're doing. No, yeah, I mean, I've spent some time thinking about this. I mean that's kind of where I'm at right now in my studies. Is I'm doing an in-depth study on evil, as it relates to naturalism and theism. And because I want to remain in the cool moment. I think in a cool moment, that's when we should be looking at assessing evils, um, and not in a moment where, let's say it's personal, right? Uh, Dad just died, something like that. That's not a moment to assess evils, because I can be okay, yeah, this is pointless. My dad was a good man, and things of that sort. So why, so I think that um, well, of course, philosophy, science, any human endeavor for rational inquiry, a lot of the time we are consistently or constantly on a journey of revamping our intuitions, or what seems to be just what we take on face value. I think that um, there are the realization of higher order goods that come from things that we think are pointless, I was actually very surprised of how many, if I just think about certain situations, natural evils, right? Why that, okay, a tsunami wiped out a whole a significant portion of this population. That serves nothing, right? Or a famine, right? Or starvation in a certain place. Um, I've actually surprised myself in my understanding that the more I've thought about that and sat down and to think about the consequences of such states of affairs, uh, actually there are explanations. in terms of either higher order goods or um, or goods that would not occur otherwise, or situations in which the only way in which to prevent such a thing would be to strip humans of the dignity of choice. Of course, if you think that humans have actually free choices, um, and when I look at places where there's starvation, hunger, and poverty in certain places in Africa, um, a lot of that is due to the negligence of a government. And so you have humans making these, free choices to neglect these people and things of that sort, or to have them keep them in conditions of that sort. And so, a lot of it isn't these, supposedly natural evils, but even in these natural evils, a lot of things can, like virtues and things that are realized as a result would actually not be realized if they didn't occur. You don't need to exercise compassion if there's not a moment in which you have to be compassionate. You don't need to exercise generosity or charity or even self-sacrifice if there are not situations that call for it. And many of those situations are going to be situations of intense suffering. The building of hospitals, the amount of goods that have gone into just an endeavor of building hospitals, and how much advancement in technology would we really think that we should have done if it wasn't on the basis of trying to help people? But if we didn't have a reason to help people in the first place, then we wouldn't have been able to exercise the human mind and human capability of rational inquiry, which is such a good thing to get us this far and things of that sort. And so you can kind of, in a cool moment, kind of see, okay, well, in the absence of such things, would the world be as rich as it would be with all the goods, distributed across? And I'm of the position, I think I agree with Trent Doherty, that we kind of live in a balanced world, that there's an equal amount of good and an equal amount of evil. That I don't think the amount of evil outweighs good. I don't think it's what we see. I think that's an interesting state of affairs that we find ourselves in. So anyway, that's kind of my winded response
Yeah,
there.
you got all these these filthy rich celebrities who squander all this money on stupid shit when they could be feeding starving kids in Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, how many could be fed with that money?
Oh, yeah.
About Betty.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, how did you get into your current working relationship with Kyle Allander?
Yeah. So Kyle and I have been friends for a couple of years. What ended up happening is John Dunphy ended up putting a group together at one point in early 2020 of kind of youngish, kind of more scholarly focused people who are into apologetics and things of that sort. And Kyle was involved in that. And Kyle and I, we just ended up naturally kind of having a lot of kind of the same thought processes on a lot of different things. And so we ended up talking quite often, and we ended up kind of being almost, philosophical partners in crime, almost, where we were able to consistently kind of hash out certain ideas or our current thinkings together. And what ended up happening is that kind of naturally led us into kind of studying the same subject in 2020, which was we wanted to study Graham Oppy, and we studied Graham Oppy's cumulative argument against theism. And I think, as you guys may know, Graham Oppy's is the greatest defender of the simplicity of naturalism. And he says that naturalism has a advantage in terms of simplicity, so it's going to have a higher intrinsic likelihood than theism, given its simplicity advantage. and things of that sort. And so we wanted to, we set out on a journey to study him and study that argument and see if it's actually true. Is naturalism a simpler theory than theism? And if naturalism can explain all the data and it's simpler than theism, then naturalism is the better theory according to standard methodology outlined in philosophy of science. So we ended up being our year-long project, and that just kind of naturally led into us writing a paper. And that led us to also having conversations with Josh Rasmussen and having a conversation on YouTube too, called Solving the Gap Problem with Unification. I highly recommend you guys check that out. I think it's a very, very underviewed conversation still.
What was that?
It's called Solving the Gap Problem with Unification. And so, yeah, I mean, we just, we had a lot of the same thinking, and we kind of, put our heads together, and a lot happened because of that. So, yeah.
So do you and Kyle share a similar view when it comes to the differentiation of the natural and the supernatural?
Yes. I'd say that we have the same view.
Can you tell the audience about, what you think about that sort of distinction?
Yeah, so the supernatural natural distinction, I think, is an unhelpful distinction. I think that it grows ever more ambiguous as time goes on. I think that, first century people would think that my 4K television over here would be of the supernatural. I think that they would have thought Teslas were probably of the supernatural. So I think that it is an unhelpful distinction, and I don't think that reality is divided into ontological parts. So you have one ontological kind being natural, and then you have one ontological kind being supernatural, and reality is just divided like that, right? I don't think that's true. So I think that I'm a monist. Kyle and I are monists, and monism is basically we realities of one ontological kind, has one underlying ontology, one fundamental substance, and we are monists because we're idealists. So we think reality is fundamentally mental in type, and so someone might say, well, I just believe everything that exists is natural. Well, then what is natural? Right, you get into what natural means. Well, natural is all the stuff in our experience. Okay, well, consciousness is in our experience. Consciousness is actually the thing that we know greater and better than any other thing. And that's one of my
natural would be what can be empirically tested and verified.
Well, right. Well, Well, what's interesting about that is I can go, okay. Well, natural. Well, that's again, what's empirical is what we're able to, is what our senses are able to pick up on, and which is ultimately apprehended through consciousness. And I'm like, okay, well, would our minds natural? Okay, well, if minds are natural, if conscious subjects are natural, then would reality still be natural if at the metaphysical bedrock, the foundation was ultimately consciousness, like a mind? If they say no, then I go, okay, well, why not? Why would that no longer be natural? And then then you have to demarcate it further. They could say something like, well, I think at bottom, it's just impersonal forces, law-governed forces. And what I take impersonal law-governed forces to mean is there's a reality that's ultimately non-mental. And so if there's reality that's ultimately non-mental in type, and that's what they mean by natural, then the supernatural natural distinction is no longer dividing reality into parts and kinds, but it's rather saying, is reality fundamentally mental, or is it fundamentally non-mental? And then, you know, you can then have a conversation about that. Is because panpsychism says that there's an aspect of consciousness to everything that exists, and it's considered natural. So what I notice is natural things, what's, you know, considered natural things, if you want to play it that way, are things that are simply imperfect. Imperfect meaning that they are not qualitatively primitive in kind, ontologically, meaning that they are the types of things that have parameters and bounds and limits on themselves. And so we think of like an initial state of the universe, right? It's a quantum state. You know, it has lowest possible energy. It's going to have behave accordingly to this. It's going to ultimately be law governed, so it's going to behave in these specific ways, mathematically describable, and it's going to have all these different parameters, degrees of energy, degrees of space, and things of that sort. And if that's what you mean by natural, then really the only thing you're saying is that the only difference in the foundations are that one has limits and the other one doesn't have limits. Or taking Rasmussen's line, it has these fundamental arbitrary limits, which are just a limit is any non-maximal quantitative feature. And so an arbitrary limit would be a non-maximal quantitative feature without an explanation. So of course, I believe that the foundation lacks those things. And so that's what I think perfection ultimately is. And so I just think that reality is either the foundations are either imperfect or perfect. And then that's how I look at it. But since I'm a monist, then it has one underlying substance, and that being mental. So that's how I look at it. And I think that often the supernatural is just things we don't understand, right? You know, natural are things that we do understand, right? And supernatural is that stuff that we don't understand. That's how often I see, you know, many amateur atheologians online. They look at it that way. And, you know, I don't know what to make of that outlook, because I don't associate myself in that kind of thinking. I've never thought like that. I think like this, what I just outlined. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's my thinking.
All right. Yeah. You know, I actually have read through you and Kyle's paper, and it's very interesting. You know, I'm on page right now. You said that, you know, when you were responding to Graham Oppie, that if a foundation is a natural fact like all other facts, and the only thing distinguishing it from the rest of the natural facts is that it is initial, then there should be no contingency whatsoever, and all natural facts should be necessary since the foundation is necessary. Could you explain that?
Yeah. So what Oppie thinks is that so if we think in terms of the foundations, right? Oppie thinks that explanation bottoms out at something that is metaphysically necessary. And he says that metaphysical necessary item is the initial state of the universe. And then he leaves open what that initial state is. He says, I'm leaving that up to the physicists. I'm not going to make any comments on what the initial state is. I'm just going to say that it has to be necessary. He says, if I'm going to look at contingency or necessity is going to be more illuminating than contingency. So it's going to have to be necessary. And he says, and necessity is just where explanation is going to stop. So it's going to stop at this initial state of the universe, some quantum state, something like that. And he says that, you know, if you ask, okay, well, how do you get contingency? From a metaphysically necessary initial state. It doesn't have volition. It doesn't have any agency. There's no choice. It just produces things. Then how do you get contingent effects? And what Oppie says is, oh well, I'm going to say that there's going to be a it causally produces things indeterministically. There's objective chance in the foundation. And so he says, then it unfolds in a chancy way. And he says that the only difference between everything of the initial state and everything that it produces is that there is no radical distinctness. One is just initial, and the other is non-initial. So what the initial state produces is just non-initial stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, if there is no radical distinctness between what the initial state is and what it produces, then it's like it's like water flowing. You start with a certain amount of water, and then you take out what's in front of it, and it just flows. And that's kind of the picture. Well, how is that stuff that it produces, if it's not radically distinct at all, and it's just the only difference is that it's non-initial, how does something via just being non-initial all of a sudden make it contingent? And that's what I mean. Like, why it should always be necessary. If the initial state is necessary, and it's an irrelevant difference is basically what I'm trying to say. It's an irrelevant difference, which is that, I gave the example, you have 5 like green blocks, and there's an initial green block in this sequence, and then you have like the 4 other ones. And you say, oh, okay, well, this green block that's initial, it has a very special feature that none of the other blocks have because it's initial. And I'm like,
it's a different shade of green.
I'm like, yeah. I'm like, so but what about being initial? Because initial is just identifying a certain point in a sequence. And so that's what he thinks. And I'm saying, okay, well, I have no reason to think that the rest of this stuff should be contingent. And so he wants to say that, it produces indeterministically. But I have further problems with that, which is why I have no reason to think that its powers should produce in an indeterministic way. And what I mean by that is that ultimately what it produces is just ultimately just going to be all brute at the end of the day. It's going to be just brute facts. There's going to be no explanation as to why it produces in the way that it does. Why does the initial state have indeterministic causation? There's no explanation. It just does. And so I think that there's a lot on 2 fronts that are left unexplained. One, why the non-initial things are any in the relevant sort different than the initial things, and then why it has that nature that gives it causal indeterminism. Now, someone might say, okay, well then why then is it the problem might exist on theism too? Well, I think the problem doesn't exist on theism, because I think that you can make an epistemic prediction from the single property of absolute perfection, and I think that you can it's an epistemic prediction that God would have perfect efficacy of will via just being absolutely perfect. So I don't think that God has a multiplicity of properties kind of packaged together. God is one single property, absolute perfection, and then power, knowledge, goodness are epistemic predictions of what absolute perfection means. So actually, God's nature explains why he has the perfect efficacy of will. But on Oppie's foundation, on naturalistic foundation, you don't get any of that. So,
what would be your favorite proof for the existence of God? There's Aristotelian, Augustinian, Neoplatonic, Thomistic.
Yeah. Well, I know that.
You're not a Thomist, so we can.
I'm not a Thomist, so I'd have to go with Leibniz. Either a Leibnizian proof or a Neoplatonic proof.
A common thing that I also would like to bring up is the fact that I don't think it would be possible for an all great God to create another, to create a morally perfect world. Because in order for God to create, God would, God's morality and his perfection and stuff is all based on the idea that he's not contingent. If
right.
And whatever God creates will be by necessity contingent, because it will be contingent on him. So by default, any world that God creates would by necessity not be morally perfect.
Right. Are you thinking along the lines of that that God's essential features, when God creates, then whatever he creates is going to have to be disanalogous to like his own like intrinsic like properties or his essential features. Like he's going to have to create something with non-essential properties or something like that, right?
I think it does this sort of, it's more of a logically following sort of thing, I would think, on God's nature. Because in order for God to create another morally perfect thing, he would have to create himself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I'm with you on that. Yeah. I think that when yes, I agree. I think that God would have to, yeah, and it's interesting when certain amateur theologians make objections like, well, God's creation has to be perfect. They don't understand the logical consequence of what it means for God and what it means for him to create something. Ultimately, it just means that he would just be himself, right? Like he would just exist alone, because if he could create something that's perfect, I think that attaching perfect to any item, like a perfect chair, it actually makes no sense, because chairs are like actually imperfect. They have these features that actually don't make it perfect. So you can't just attach perfect and then to something. Like it just has to either be perfection or it just is not, or it's just imperfect. So for him to create a perfect earth or a perfect plant, those are some words just being strung together in my mind. That's not a metaphysically possible action. So yeah, I'm with you on that.
Yeah. So, like I always say is that, God could not create a morally perfect world, because that would be, God would have to create himself, and God can't create himself because he by necessity can't be created.
Yeah.
So, another sort of common objection to theism is the idea of sincere non-believers.
Mm-hmm.
Like, J.L. Schoenberg.
It's the famous Roman verse that they are without excuse.
But I mean, J.L. Schoenberg's argument really is that, basically that, there are non-resistant non-believers, meaning that there are atheists that would sincerely want to have a relationship with God and be in union with him, but they can't, they can't make themselves come to that belief.
Right.
What would you make of that sort of thing? And what would your answer be?
Yeah. So this, divine hiddenness. There's disagreements among theologians and atheist philosophers and theist philosophers on whether or not um, divine hiddenness is under the category of evil, or if evils are all under the category of hiddenness. It's interesting. Um, I I know that Trent Doherty thinks that ultimately all evils are subsumed under hiddenness, the problem of divine hiddenness. So I think that's an interesting take. So if you view it in terms of that, then I think it kind of switches gears in terms of how you think about it. I think that um, one way there's different ways to think about the problem of hiddenness, the problem, because if you put it as a problem, it's like, okay, if we don't figure this out, then pack up your bags, we're done, but it's
kind of like
you
the
can
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say it's kind of like the problem of evil. It's only a problem if there is no God.
Yeah, because then it's just indifference, and whole hypothesis of indifference is like what?
Didn't mean to cut you off track. Go on.
Oh, okay. No, you're good. You got me thinking about the hypothesis of indifference, and I've been thinking about that lately. But anyways, the one way is, you can deny that there are such things as non-resistant non-believers. I think that I lean towards the view that human psychology is incredibly complex, and that it's I don't think it's a feasible action to always be in the cool moment when it comes about desiring to hold certain beliefs or not. That I go back further. We aren't logic machines. So we think that, okay, well, all I need is one single piece of evidence or one single thing to be acquainted with, and then I will change my views. Right? We like to think that we're like that. And I'm gonna say, what, I just don't know if human psychology really reveals that. And sorry, what?
Yeah. What I was going to, say is that I think a lot of theists get worked up because they bring it down to free will. I personally like to go with a different answer, that it does not matter whether or not personally if there is free will in the sort of libertarian sense. My way of explaining it would be in terms of, what if it was like, say, just because someone is a sincere non-believer does not mean that necessarily the conditions by which they would be changed into, a believer would be feasible for God to actualize. Let's say, for example, the condition for, let's say you're an atheist, and let's say you're a sincere non-believer. You sincerely want a relationship with God, but you, for some reason, just can't get yourself to believe. Now, one could ask, well, why doesn't God just make himself clear to you? And I would like to say that, what if it was that the only way that God could become clear to you, like the only condition that in your mind that would make you believe in God, is a sort of act that God cannot, by definition, actualize.
So not a feasible action.
Yeah. For example, let's say, in order for you to believe God exists, that God would have to be non-virtuous with you. Like, let's say, if God just came in randomly and slapped you in the face for no reason, that would make you believe. Or let's say, if God made you a square circle, that would make you believe that God exists. Well, if those are the conditions by which you, even in a sincere state, might have, you know, it would be impossible for God to actualize that in state. And it would not be because God lacks the power, it's that the action itself that would require you to change is simply illogical.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I say this really has nothing to do with free will, because even if you accept a more compatibilistic account where there is determinism, but you still make choices, you know, even in that sort of scenario, it would still, you know, be a condition that was put in place, you know, results in you not being able to have an actual state where you could choose a a condition where you would believe that would be possible for God to actualize. So, you know, irregardless of whether what position you take on free will, it could work. Where it's simply that the conditions that would make you not believe, I mean, that would make you believe is simply something that God cannot do.
Yeah. I think that um looking at it in terms of, you know, what is feasible for God to do is highly important, because people often think in terms of, well, what's logically possible, you know, what's strictly broadly logically possible. And you know, like I you know, it's logically possible, you know, for something to be read but to not be extended at all. But it actually isn't metaphysically possible for there to be something that is read and to have no extension at all. And so I think that when we look at, okay, feasible actions, we have to look in terms of feasibility and not simply in terms of what is like logically possible and things of that sort, for God to do. And I think that ultimately, like you mentioned, it illuminates a lot. Um, you know, I think that, you know, a lot of responses to hiddenness, you know, point out one thing, which is, you know, God's goal, you know, if we're thinking in terms of perfect being theism, you know, perfect being theology, then God's goal isn't to simply show you that he exists. God's goal is to have this divine relationship with you. And so God's not concerned simply with like okay, hey, I exist, you know, and stuff like that, you know, because, you know, all right, you know, we know that so many things in life exist, but we don't think about them, you know, we move on. But God wants to, you know, given the character and the nature of what a perfect being would be, he wanted a relationship. And there are certain situations, um, in which, in which to achieve those ends, God simply just like you said, slapping you in the face or like, you know, distracting you all the time would not be conducive to having that relationship, fulfilling relationship. Now I know there's a lot more to unpack there, and of course this is something that Schellenberg has not. He's heard this before, right, and things of that sort. But this is just kind of just, you know, unpacking it slowly, and kind of just like me kind of just adding something you said there. So I think it's interesting. I think it's if we took a look in terms of feasibility and things of that sort, and actions and what might be the motives of such a being, then because I mean Schellenberg, you know, he has his premises. He says, you know, um, a perfect being will do X, and you know, that.
But then you
that
had to be all
this,
then you'd have to be all knowing in order to know what a perfect being would do.
well, yeah, you have this assumption in which it's almost being presented as if it's non-trivial. And I'm like, well, that assumption is trivial, you know, and it kind of goes back to my whole view of my arguments earlier, which is, well, I have some different views on that, and so I can't just accept your premise as if it's a non-trivial premise. There's almost it's non-trivial premises are really hard to come by. So I look at that in that way. I'm like, okay, yeah, this needs to be unpacked a lot more.
Would you regard Graham Oppy as a sincere non-believer?
That's a good question.
Like you would believe if the evidence presented itself, or is he sure of his position?
Okay, so he's definitely sure of his position.
Yeah, sure. I mean that sure, like Gnostic sure.
I don't know what Graham. I don't know. It's interesting, which is Graham's an interesting guy, which is I don't know like what he's like personally. Like, you know,
Yeah,
like what are his,
as William Lane Craig said, he's scary smart. Scary smart.
Yeah, that's actually pretty good. Um Graham has over the course of his career has launched some of the most rigorous critiques of theism and theistic arguments of theistic philosophers. And so Graham seems like the type of person that there's really going to be no deathbed conversions for him. So epistemically, you know, theism has no purchase for him. But I don't know what his actual personal thought life is when it comes to spirituality and things of that sort. And so I can't really say exactly like where Graham is in terms of how, you know, where his where his sincerity is at, and think I think that he I like to think that he would be the type of person to you know, if theism was shown itself to be the better theory, then he would accept that. But I think that, you know, there's a long way to go from theism to kind of Christianity. And so, I mean, I'm a Christian universalist, right? So, you know, I there's just hope for Graham. There's never not going to be hope for Graham. But he seems on the intellectual side, he seems to be a someone who looks at things in a sincere way and judges it and calls it as he sees it, and his conclusions have, you know, been on the side of atheism. So
Yeah, I remember, you know, so you say that you're a universalist. You know, a common thing that I think many atheists, what gets them into atheism is the problem of hell on Christianity.
Right.
And it's generally an argument against the eternal conscious torment view. A common sort of
most of them have in mind is that they're actually physically tortured in hell, even though it's a non-physical dimension.
Right.
But yeah, what I always take as sort of funny is that, you know, I said that it is possible for someone to experience an infinite amount of torture, but we would say that it's still not enough, because it gets into the differentiation between temporal punishment and more qualitative punishment.
Right.
Let's take, for example, this. Let's say you have Hitler, and Hitler is in hell, and for his punishment, you know, a demon comes over and slaps him on the wrist. It's very hard. It hurts his hand a bit, you know, but, you know, it's more annoying than anything, but that's his punishment. He gets slapped on the wrist by a demon.
As opposed to getting a pineapple shoved up his ass every morning.
Yeah, but I mean, what happens is that, so let's take that pain, for example, that he feels when the demon slaps him on the wrist. Let's say that, you know, every day after that, the pain is a little bit less. Like, let's say it goes down like one little notch in quality. After an infinite amount of time, or at least close to it, imagine how it's decreasing like that. You know, and over an infinite amount of time, in theory, that would be that Hitler suffered an infinite, like when you do the math, it comes out that Hitler had an infinite amount of pain. When he experienced an infinite amount of pain. But we still say, well, wait a minute, him getting slapped on the wrist for all eternity,
yeah, that's okay. I see where you're going with this. That's interesting. I've never thought about it like that.
So basically what happens, like, if let's say he gets slapped on the wrist, and every day from then it just slowly gets decreased in pain, but over an infinite amount of time, it still works out to be an infinite amount of pain.
Yeah.
And we'd be saying, well, wait a minute, getting slapped on the wrist for all eternity doesn't really seem to be equivalent to what Hitler did.
Yeah.
So I think a way a person of eternal conscious torment could go about it is to say that every day the person would be getting the exact right amount of punishment over an infinite amount of time. So they would still have an infinite amount of pain, or experience an infinite amount of pain, but it would always be the right amount.
Right.
And it's funny because that would be the same even if, let's say, we take the more extreme versions of eternal conscious torment, where, you're literally, like I've always joked about it, you get thrown into an eternal barbecue pit where you're getting sodomized by Satan's pitchfork. And if you have that intense amount of pain for all eternity, it works out that you're suffering an infinite amount of pain. And like the whole demon wrestling also comes out to be an infinite amount of pain. So in the grand scheme of things, whether it's like a decreasing amount of pain over an infinite amount of time, or an increasing amount of pain for an infinite amount of time, you're going to get the exact same result.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that's ultimately why I see the whole doctrine of eternal conscious torment as an unnecessary postulation. If all that really matters is that you get your sufficient punishment, then that doesn't need to be. Then it seems the timeline of infinity just seems to be auxiliary, where I can just shave that off and I can just keep the sufficient punishment. And of course, as a universalist, I say, okay, then God redeems them. They have atoned for their sins, and then God redeems them. And so that's ultimately how I look at it. That each person, God will judge you on the basis of what you did in this life. Those who have not accepted His Son, and then God can restore them and redeem them subsequent. So that's how I look at the Hitler. That's how I look at the whole Hitler situation.
Yeah,
because I don't think anybody in heaven. There's not gonna be a single person in heaven who's not sanctified.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I look at that.
All right. Well, we've come past the hour mark on this. I'm gonna be getting myself something to eat pretty soon.
Yeah, no, it's been good. I actually kind of got to go too.
Yeah. So, would you like to ask him the final, to tell him about his projects and stuff, Carlos?
What final projects are working on, and where can the dear audience find you?
Sorry, what was the question?
What future projects are you working on, and where can the dear audience find you?
Yeah, so future projects. I'll be doing. I'll be doing more. Well, okay. So right now, I am working through arguments from evil and an understanding that as an in-depth project, as an in-depth study. And then I'll be releasing kind of the what I've learned from that in terms of videos, and I'm going to be trying to write more blog posts and things of that sort on some of these ideas. I'm going to be making videos on my cumulative case, and then delivering some papers that have really been sparking my interest and really been kind of changing my thinking and things of that sort into where I'm at now. And then, of course, I'm going to be trying to do more evolution, biological evolution topics and videos of that sort, challenging intelligent design and creationism. And of course, I actually think it serves as well confirmation. What?
When's that coming?
So I'm currently actually editing one video on evolution right now. So working through that, I think it's gonna be 13 minutes long. So editing that, and that should be out within the next 2 months. So yeah, that's just kind of like what I'm doing, kind of where I'm at. I'm all juggling them right now, but yeah, that's kind of just what I have kind of planned.
Where can they find you?
Yeah, Invoking Theism. So on all social platforms, my blog too. It's just Invoking Theism. And my Twitter is where I'm most active. So if you want to see what I'm thinking about throughout the week and who I'm interacting with, go ahead and follow me on Twitter.
All right. Go invoke theism. Good night and God bless.